From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about the future of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and its proxy warfare strategy. The IRGC is the branch of the Iranian military charged with safeguarding the Islamic Republic. It's responsible for domestic security through the Basij militia, Iran's missile program, and Tehran's activities abroad, most notably its network of proxy forces across the Middle East, from Hezbollah in Lebanon to the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq. The future of the IRGC is a particularly timely topic for discussion in light of the recent U.S. missile strike in Syria and the rocket attacks on Iraqi bases hosting U.S. forces. There's a lot to discuss, but thankfully we've got a very knowledgeable guest on the program today, Alex Vatanka. Alex is the head of MEI's Iran program and a senior fellow with the Frontier Europe Initiative. He's also the author of a recently published paper on the IRGC and Iran's proxy warfare strategy, available on the New America website. Alex, welcome back to the podcast.
Hello, Alistair. Great that you will have me back.
You're welcome anytime, Alex. Alex, to start off with, since it's in the very title of your paper, can you explain to our listeners what exactly is Iran's forward descent strategy and how did it come about?
At the moment, if you listen to the sort of majority opinion about the Revolutionary Guards and what it seeks to do in the Middle East, in Washington, it's this view that they're actually just out in the region exporting their Islamist ideology, the revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini that was born in 1979. And to put it, crudely but simply, that they are up to no good in places like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere in the Middle East. And, that is the message that, by and large, you will hear here in Washington. Now, if you take the same question and ask folks in a place like Tehran, I think you will hear slightly different, obviously, message, certainly if you ask officials in the Iranian regime. What you will hear is, this is not about us going in the region and looking for trouble. This is part of our forward defense. This is actually what they would argue a defensive measure on our part. These proxies are meant to defend Iranian interest in the region and above all to deter rivals of Iran from wanting to take the fight to Iran's own soil, if you will. So let me give you one example. What is Iran doing in Syria or has been doing in Syria for the last 10 years? The narrative from Tehran is it's to fight Sunni jihadist extremists that have an ideology that has no time for Iran, that seeks the death of all Shia. And the Iranian regime argues, why not fight them in Syria while they're still small and manageable as a threat, instead of waiting for them to get big and then get to a point where they actually, threaten Iran's national security. And they would argue what they did in places like Syria and later on in Iraq in 2014-15 was to prevent the rise of such threats by using these paramilitary groups that are loyal to Iran, which largely are not made up of Iranians, but of Syrians, Lebanese, Iraqis, Afghans, Pakistanis, but all sort of want to fight under this Iranian command. So roughly where you are in terms of the sort of reading of why Iran uses paramilitary groups the way they have done is these two narratives that I just played out there, Alistair.
Alex, I wanted to touch on the figure of Qassem Suleimani. The development and expansion of Iran's proxy warfare strategy is in many ways kind of inextricably linked to his rise. And he was the longtime head of the IRGC Quds Force, its foreign operations branch. What role did he play in all of this?
He was a fascinating man in many ways. You don't have to like Qassem Soleimani to accept the fact that he led a pretty interesting life while he was with us. I mean, he was someone with no military background. He came from a poor family in a poor part of a relatively impoverished central Iranian province of Kerman. He was a young man when he left school, didn't really have much of a formal education. By the time of Iran's revolution of 1979, he was a young man in his early 20s. He jumps on this bandwagon of the revolution of Ayatollah Khomeini, very quickly, as we know, the Iran-Iraq war started in September of 1980, and Qassem Soleimani finds himself as someone who simply just put on the uniform. Again, no formal military background or education as such, but ends up fighting in the Iran-Iraq war for the next 8 years. And by the time that war ends, he has risen through the ranks. We can discuss why that happened. But, he clearly was someone who was at the right place at the right time on many occasions. And above all, he developed a close personal relationship with the man who later became the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who in the 1980s was a president of the Islamic Republic and would often go to the front and see these younger commanders like Qassem Soleimani. He cultivated these individuals like Qassem Soleimani deliberately. So you have that bond, and, it just turned out nice for Qassem Soleimani that one of the clerics that Qassem Soleimani was closest to happened to end up becoming the supreme leader eventually in 1989. So he spent then a few years kind of in the gray zone, not knowing what he wanted to do. But very quickly, as you pointed out, Alistair, he's appointed by the supreme leader Khamenei to head the Quds Force, the external branch for operations of the Revolutionary Guards. His first kind of file, if you will, is to go out there and see what Iran could do to contain the threat that was emerging in the East, in Afghanistan, with the rise of the Taliban. And, that was his beginning. That was where he kind of spent most of his energy. At this point, late 1990s, he's still a very, a murky, shadowy figure. He's in behind the curtain, if you will. That was the role. By 2001, with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, there are sort of references to Qassem Soleimani, the Quds Force, because the U.S. and Iran at times had tactical cooperation against the Taliban. And then 2003 happened, and the U.S. goes into Iraq. And by then, Qassem Soleimani's profile, and that was done deliberately by him and the Revolutionary Guards, is far more public. He's out there suddenly. His name is out there. His picture is out there. And whereas U.S. and Iran in the fight against Taliban in 2001 sort of were in the same side, if you will, by 2004-05, it's clear that Iran and U.S. will be on different sides in the struggle for post-Saddam Iraq. And that's how the American public soon enough got to learn about who Qassem Soleimani is, as this Iranian general who was spearheading militiamen in Iraq against anti-Shia political forces in that country, but soon enough also against the United States.
Alex, next I wanted to touch on a few of the countries where Iran has been involved with its proxy forces. As you mentioned earlier, the most famous case is, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iran has tried to replicate that elsewhere in the region. How successful has Tehran been in general, and do you think there's a Hezbollah model that can be replicated, or is it a sort of sui generis?
No, I think, it's certainly one of the most interesting questions to ask right now. I mean, when we talk about what are the issues dividing the United States and its allies and Iran at the moment, on the one hand, you got the nuclear issue. Then you often hear the sort of concerns that countries out there have about Iran's missile program. But very quickly, people will also point out that actually these paramilitary groups that are operating under auspices of Iranian management, we don't like that. And the reason why they don't like that is because, there are basically these paramilitary groups are governments within governments. You pointed out, Alistair, to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah in Lebanon has been in business now for almost 40 years. It's a consolidated model. It has, been tested by time. And, you could argue it's the most powerful political entity in Lebanon of today. In the case of Iraq, you are, only, less than 2 decades into post-Saddam period, where a lot of those Iranian, political Iraqi figures close to Iran that, for example, made up organizations like the formerly known as the Ba'ath Corps, they've been around now for less than 20 years. They are significantly more powerful today than they were, say, a decade or decade and a half ago. Are they in a position to dominate Iraq the way Hezbollah dominates Lebanon? Probably not. I mean, if you look at Prime Minister Qasem in Iraq today, it seems to me he has more power as the prime minister than is the case with the prime minister in Lebanon. But the question to be asked is, what if Qasem's position is weakened going forward, and what if nothing is done to contain the political and the military capabilities of militiamen, paramilitary organizations? I mean, there are so many names for them: popular mobilization forces and so forth, whatever you want to call them. But if they're not stopped, could there soon be a moment where we have something like Hezbollah in Iraq that is as powerful as Hezbollah is in Lebanon, that basically is a state within a state? And that obviously, if you are the United States or allies of the United States, that's not good news. That means you don't even know who to deal with anymore. Who would you hold? I mean, we're speaking at a time where we've seen in recent days attacks on bases in Iraq that are home to U.S. military personnel. Who does Washington hold accountable? The central government, or do you have to hold account paramilitary organizations that are often very much aligned with the Iranian regime? And my point simply is this, Alistair, that this is a trend that's been in motion in a place like Lebanon for over 40 years, in Iraq for just under 20 years. It could happen elsewhere. It could happen in a place. I mean, that's one of the concerns the Saudis have in Yemen with the Houthis. So it could happen elsewhere. And a nightmare scenario is across the Middle East, you have a number of situations where there are governments that are weak, that are unable to manage controlling their own territories because they are paramilitary organizations that are so powerful they can act their own way, oftentimes in tandem with the Islamic Republic of Iran. And I'm not saying there's no way you can stop this. There are obviously measures one can take to prevent this trend from growing, or at least slow down the acceleration. But it's certainly been a trend. And the Islamic Republic looks at this as an investment. These paramilitary groups are seen as investments worthwhile because it gives Iran a sort of extended arm into the region through these local organizations in Arab countries, like in Iraq, in Lebanon, and Syria, in Yemen, and perhaps other places in the future. And from their perspective, these investments have been worthwhile.
The case of Iraq, Alex, also does raise some additional interesting questions. One of which is the kind of pushback against Iranian influence that comes out of this whole kind of state capture and rise of the paramilitaries. And we saw this most prominently in Iraq with the burning of the Iranian consulate in Najaf in late 2019. What do you think that the case of Iraq tells us about the kind of limits of Iran's proxy model and its ability to kind of meddle in other countries' domestic politics?
Look, I mean, there's one way of looking at this, which is to kind of look at it in terms of how this model, this state within a state model, has performed in the mother country, in this case, Iran. So how has the Revolutionary Guards actually performed inside of Iran? Well, it's a very powerful entity. It's, as I said, it's a state within a state. It doesn't need to run for elections, and still is so powerful it can, stop measures by, say, President Hassan Rouhani. And you don't have to take my word for it. Listen to the speeches of Hassan Rouhani, the elected president in the Islamic Republic. He often says, you know what? My rivals, meaning the Revolutionary Guards, not only do they control so much of the media, so much of the economy, but they also control so much of the arms, the guns, the military capabilities. And on top of that, what the Revolutionary Guards have done is upset so many of the ordinary Iranians through their very draconian policies, because they are always seeking maximum control of the population. And the corruption that are involved doesn't help them either. So you got in Iran a Revolutionary Guards today that has to defend against charges of being corrupt, and they are facing lots of charges of corruption, because that is not something we make up. Revolutionary Guards are often involved in corrupt practices because they constantly looking to gain more economic riches, and that's just a label that's on them, and I think is a justified label. So, in other words, if this model has so much to answer for in Iran, where the Revolutionary Guards have been evolving since 1979, what makes us think that it's going to be that much better in a place like Iraq or in another country in the Middle East? Now, you could also look at it from the point of view of the receiving countries. So, if you are Iraq, if you are a country that has a weak central government and you're constantly trying to keep foreigners out, foreign powers like Iran out, that has clearly been a struggle for them. So the way you could perhaps argue you could deal with a threat like the emergence of paramilitary groups that become so powerful you can't stop them anymore is to go in as early as you can and work against security vacuums and other types of vacuums emerging. And what do I mean by other types of vacuums? I mean, the obvious one that comes to mind are economic conditions. In a place like Iraq, we've seen, and elsewhere in the Arab world, given the demographics, the young part of the population that's disillusioned, that is looking for something to do in life, mixed with the fact that some, governments and some semi-governmental organizations are constantly injecting religious bigotry, sectarianism into it. In a place like Iraq, where you got the demographics that you have, young population, a Shia majority and Sunni minority, and then you got the Kurds on the top, you have a condition where, you will have young people who might be attracted to some of these messages that are coming from groups that are aligned with the Revolutionary Guards. The sort of, the only way forward is militancy. The only way forward is to sort of, defend your community. Factors such as seeking compromises and coexistence sort of thrown out of the window in the process. So, Alistair, I look at it from two different angles. One is I look at it and say, well, it hasn't really worked out in Iran. The only reason the Revolutionary Guards are in charge or as powerful as they are today is not because they have sought or successfully become a legitimate entity in the eyes of the majority of the Iranian people. It's simply because they control the guns, have managed to hang on to their guns, and anybody else who gets in their way will simply be sidelined. If not, worse things could happen to them. The challenge for the rest of the region is to make sure your youth have jobs, your economy is somewhat a priority instead of forgetting about it. You deal with corruption, you deal with religious bigotry, you deal with all these things that have created a kind of very explosive, conditions in the Middle East in the last decade or plus, certainly since the Arab Spring, emerged on the scene in December of 2010 in Tunisia. So I think definitely there are things one can do to contain the rise of the paramilitary model. But at the same time, let's not kid ourselves. There are entities out there like the Revolutionary Guards that are constantly trying to expand on this model. And they use whatever money they have and media operations and you name it to advance the cause that they believe in.
Alex, we've covered a lot of ground here, but before we wrap up, we're currently in a moment of escalating US-Iran tensions as both countries seek to gain leverage ahead of presumably a resumption of talks around the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Iran seems to be making aggressive use of its proxies in the region, especially in Iraq, as we mentioned earlier, to kind of ramp up pressure on the U.S. How do you expect that dynamic to play out going forward, and the role that the proxies will play within that?
Alistair, I actually think in a best case scenario, what you want to do if you are the United States is you want to deal with the issue that you care about more than anything else from an American national security point of view, which is the ticking bomb that is Iran's nuclear program. You sort of want to take that file, separate it from everything else, and you want to solve that. You want to put the brakes on that, and you want to, whether it's a JCPOA of 2015 or JCPOA plus or whatever it is, but you want to deal with that, and that's not good for the United States. A nuclear armed Iran is certainly not good for the Middle East. You will end up with a nuclear race of sorts. It might start as a civilian, but it could easily escalate and countries could set out to become nuclear weapon states. And that's not good for the region. It's certainly something that ought to be prevented. So I would go about it that way. And I think that's where the Biden administration is at right now. I mean, they've tried to sort of see if they could add all sorts of other things on the menu, and clearly the Iranians have resisted. That doesn't come as a surprise to those of us who are Iran watchers and read the Persian language sources. This has been the writing on the wall for some time. But just because you reach a nuclear deal with Iran doesn't mean you then sit back and accept anything they do in the region, including the way they exercise the power they have on these paramilitary organizations. You can still take action against them. There's nothing in the negotiations that could happen and probably will happen soon that says you have to accept the reality of paramilitary groups that behave in any way they wish in the region, in places like Iraq and Syria. You could, in a worst case scenario, if you believe in the kinetic option, you could take the Israeli approach. I mean, the Israelis have been using their Air Force to bomb these pro-Iran groups in Syria for a few years now. And the reality is the United States has not really taken that option seriously for a number of factors. But, the reality is this. The rise of the paramilitary organizations outside of Iraq is something that, is linked to the Arab Spring. So it's about 10 years old as a phenomenon. It really took off in Syria, when you had the Fatimiyun, the Zainabiyun, the Afghan, the Pakistani volunteers being shipped in by Iran in the defense of the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So this model has been working for about 10 years. Except the Israelis, nobody's really hit them hard. I'm saying if the United States felt it's something that it needs to do, and they don't have to do it exactly the way the Israelis have done it, but the U.S. Air Force can bring a lot of damage from above without American troops on the ground, with costs being, financial as opposed to being measured in blood. And that in turn, if you hit back, and I'm not advocating it, but I'm saying it's an option, if you hit back, that just might help the cost-benefit analysis that the Iranians constantly have to perform. It's not like the Iranian regime, including Revolutionary Guards, just do things and nothing will shape their calculations. The fact is, the price they've paid so far for waging the paramilitary model has been limited. They don't spend billions of dollars on these guys. The last few years, the number we often hear from sources on the ground is that, an Afghan volunteer coming in with the help of Iran to fight in Syria gets about $500 a month. And you have to supply them with small arms and so forth, but the bill is not huge. So Iran, from a financial point of view, hasn't had to pay greatly for this model. The Iranians very deliberately did not send many Iranians to places of conflict in Syria. They decided not to do that. So they would rely on volunteers. And you can see you can hear from what I just said, there are areas where you can find that pressure point and say to the Iranians through action and through other means that, are you sure you want to stick to this model? And I think, that has not been tested. The U.S. hasn't tested. It can test it even as it's, negotiating with Iran separately on the nuclear issue. It's that sort of old saying of being able to walk and chew gum at the same time. You can do that, and I think the U.S. can do that. Hopefully, we won't get to that. Hopefully, you'll have some kind of a broader diplomatic conversation between U.S. allies and Iran where everybody decides to cool down and everybody decides to sort of take a step back. Because the other hard reality is the notion that everything that's going wrong in the Middle East is Iran's fault is obviously nonsense. There are other actors that are involved. Many countries are using not exactly the same model of the proxy groups that Iran is using, but similar types of activities are happening by other regional states. So everybody needs to take a hard look at what they're doing, how far they want to continue on this path, how much, how deep they want to dig themselves into something that looks like a quagmire for many states. Because if they decide to get out of what I would classify as a quagmire of sorts, then I think the region as a whole would benefit from it. The proxy model is not going to be an attractive model in the Middle East, where economies are healthy, normal, where there's trade, where there's jobs, where there's coexistence, concessions being given by one state to another across the board. And I know it sounds almost naive because we haven't grown up in the last few decades thinking of the Middle East in those terms, but that's exactly what we need to do. We need to start thinking out of the box. We need to be, we need to be looking in terms of very different visions for the region. And those of us in Washington, we can only hope that regional leaders will do exactly that, to seek to find solutions to the problems that they have had with one another, instead of investing in very short-term models like the use of proxy militiamen.
We'll have to leave things there for today, but thank you again for joining us, Alex.
Thank you, Alistair. Great to be with you.
It's been a great conversation. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in, and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.